welcome to the 2025 Annual Conference of the FEMC. I'm Will Holzer. I'm with the State of Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, Division of Forestry, where I'm the State Lands Program Supervisor for the division. Today, I'm also on the steering committee as the Vice Chair, but I'm acting as the Chair today because Kyle Lombard wasn't able to join us. So, it's my pleasure to kick off the conference this year, where we'll be exploring how we can expand partnerships and apply science and adaptive strategies to strengthen our future forests. And just in review, this year was a great year for the FEMC. They've been able to expand the collaborative network, deliver on projects, bring on student employees to help with everything from data analysis to conference room planning. They've completed a fifth-year region-wide forest health monitoring and much, much more. Also during the past year, each state held a state partnership committee meeting where they helped identify the priorities of the region. And yesterday, the FEMC joint committees met to discuss potential project concepts for development over the next year. I'd like to thank all the experts and leaders in the region who helped to build up and sustain the cooperative, and to the Forest Service for its continued support for the program. I would also like to give thanks to our conference planning committee. Alyssa Schutt, Al Freeman, Walker Kamrick, Jessica Cancelleri, Jason Hill, and Gretchen Nereff. This is going to be a great day, so take advantage of the opportunities to learn, meet with collaborators, and celebrate our community's work this year. And with that, I'd like to welcome Allison Adams, the Director of FEMC, to the stage.
All right, hi everybody, good morning. Thanks, Will. It's really great to be here today with all of you. We have more than 200 people here today and several additional folks joining us online, and I'm really excited to get to hear from and speak with a lot of you today. I want to start this morning with a land acknowledgement. The campus of the University of Vermont sits within a place of gathering and exchange, shaped by water and stewarded by ongoing generations of Indigenous peoples, in particular the Western Abenaki. Acknowledging the relations between water, land, and people is in harmony with the mission of the university. Acknowledging the serious and significant impacts of our histories on Indigenous peoples and their homelands is a part of the university's ongoing work of teaching, research, and engagement, and is an essential reminder of our past and our interconnected futures for the many of us gathered on this land. UVM respects the Indigenous knowledge interwoven in this place and commits to uplifting the Indigenous peoples and cultures present on this land and within our community. FEMC's work additionally takes place in the traditional homelands of many Indigenous nations, and I'm going to name them all, I think. The Cayuga Nation, the Oneida Nation, the Onondaga Nation, the St. Regis Mohawk Tribe, the Seneca Nation, and Tonawanda Band of Seneca, the Tuscarora Nation, the Passamaquoddy, the Penobscot, the Holton Band of Maliseet Indians, the Mi'kmaq Nation, the Mashpee Wampanoag Tribe and the Wampanoag Tribe of Aquinnah, the Mashantucket Pequot Indian Tribe, the Mohegan Tribe, and the Narragansett Indian Tribe. As an organization, we recognize the past and ongoing harms to these peoples and lands and commit to a continuing process of recognition and justice in our work. So this has been quite the year for FEMC, as I'm sure it has been for many people in this room, with threats to funding for research, attempts to change or eliminate the work of including marginalized communities in our programs, and a growing sense of dis-ease and division in many arenas. On top of this, protections for public lands are backsliding, and technology feels like it is advancing so rapidly that we must simultaneously figure out how to incorporate new tools while reckoning with their costs. I know that many of these things weigh heavily on my mind every day, and I'm sure they do for many of you too. And so in that context, I'm really, really glad that we get to spend this time together here today to do the important work of connecting with each other in person. Hearing the ways that forest research and management is continuing to move forward despite many hurdles, exploring how new technologies can advance the work we do, and continuing to forge the relationships and collaborations that can make our work stronger and more resilient. And speaking of continuing to do this work, I want to share some updates from FEMC's work in 2025. This year, FEMC expanded and updated old projects and dove headfirst into some new work. So, for example, we continued our analysis of forest clearing, conversion, and regrowth across the region at 10-meter resolution and annual time steps covering 10 years. This work is still underway. We've completed composite images across multiple years and done all of the requisite pre-processing and have completed state-level models. And now we're working on regional scaling, and we did hit some delays because of the size of the data we're dealing with and just the processing time, but we expect the final product will be available in early 2026. This year, we also continued our work to build an interactive and spatially explicit database for insect eDNA metabarcoding information, which may be able to aid in early identification of potential threats from introduced insects, as well as serving a number of other important monitoring and research purposes. This year, we identified a UX/UI design firm and have been working with them for a few months now to develop and refine the interface. Here's an example of the designs that are coming out. I'm really excited about them. I think it's going to be really cool. It's going to look really good, and we're expecting to begin building the beta version of this database in 2026. We also made some significant improvements to the Northeast Forest Inventory Network this year. This is a project that FEMC released in 2023 that standardizes and aggregates data from disparate continuous forest inventories across New England and New York, multiplying the power of all of the constituent CFIs to draw broader conclusions about forests across the region. And this year, we streamlined the process for adding new programs to that. So if you have a continuous forest inventory that you're interested in being represented in NEFIN, definitely find somebody from FEMC and talk to us about how you can get that done. And then we also added data from 3 new programs, so this database continues to grow. We also had another successful year of regional forest health monitoring, marking our 5th year of region-wide data collection. Many of you know we have tens of years of data in Vermont, but regionalized several years ago, and so we're building up that regional time series data set. We visited plots in all 7 states, but we did, due to some unexpected challenges in Maine, we didn't get to the further out plots in Maine this year, but we do expect to return to them in 2026. As always, our assessments continued monitoring the health of the overstory, took measurements of seedling regeneration, sapling survivorship, and damage from browse, and a number of other variables. And all of the data from our forest health monitoring is available for free on the FEMC website. New this year was the addition of jumping worms to our monitoring protocol. So we worked really closely with UVM professor Joseph Goris to develop a quick protocol that could be easily integrated with our monitoring plots. And I'm not going to spoil what we found, but if you want to know, Ben Porter's presenting on this in one of the concurrent sessions this afternoon, and you should attend that. I will say that we're going to continue this survey work for several years, so more to come on this. Also new this year was FEMC's participation in the Nature Conservancy's Tree Species in Peril project, which is working to conserve tree species currently under severe threat, including trees like hemlock and ash. This project will run for 2 years. We started work on it in the fall, and we're leveraging our capabilities with our monitoring network to establish some new, particularly ash-focused monitoring plots, and working to identify lingering ash trees that can be used for tree breeding across the region. And then we're also working to identify some new locations of black ash, landowners who might have black ash on their land, to help support the conservation of that cultural keystone species as well. The last project I'm going to mention is a pilot survey we did this year looking at perceptions of forest health and threats, as well as non-material values related to forests. This pilot was limited to Vermont because there's an existing annual survey that comes out of the University of Vermont that we could submit some questions to, so it was a really convenient way to pilot this. And we partnered with Vermont Forest Parks and Rec and Vermont Fish and Wildlife to develop these questions. So the chart that I'm showing up here is just one of the results from that related to perceptions of forest threats. So we asked people to rank this list of potential threats from 1 to 10, and then this is showing the orange bars are who ranked that particular threat first, second, or third for a current threat, and then blue bars are for future threats. There's a lot of information here. The thing that I like to mention that I think is really interesting is that those few things that are specifically really explicitly climate change related, warmer winters, extreme floods and storms, forest fires, people are recognizing that those are current threats, but there's still more people who think of these as future threats than current threats, despite the fact that in Vermont we've had a couple of years of really severe flooding, a really severe drought, so I think there's still some communication work to be done around that. And then I think the other thing that may be interesting to people in this room is that the too much management or not enough management, these are not things that people are ranking as very high on their list of concerns, though I know people tend to be very loud about when there are concerns about that on one side or the other, but overall, from our sample, this is not ranking super high, but if anything, currently not enough management and cutting is more of a current concern. So I thought that was really interesting, an interesting thing to hear from this survey. Also this is another set of results, reasons for interacting with Vermont's forests. So you can see this is the same structure. People rank these 1 to 10, the darkest bars, people who ranked it first, et cetera. And you can see like aesthetics, physical health, mental health, recreation. These are very typical things to see for non-material values in the sort of top rankings, but in Vermont, spirituality ranking 5th and far above many others, I thought was a really interesting result and maybe something kind of unique about how people are interacting with forests in Vermont, and probably a lot to think about there. So we're talking about whether we want to regionalize this, if that makes sense, what questions we might ask. This was a hot topic of conversation at our planning meeting yesterday. So it may end up being a regional project, it may not, but something to keep an eye on. If it does, we hope to repeat it on regular time steps, maybe every 3 to 5 years or so. And before we move on to the next part of the plenary, I want to take some time to thank the many people, agencies, and organizations who make FEMC's work and this conference possible. So first of all, FEMC's staff, who do just an absolutely enormous amount of work to bring you all of the things that I was just talking about, and that was really barely scratching the surface of what FEMC does over the course of a year, and then also, of course, contributing a lot to the planning of this conference. Also, our state partners, who are led by our state coordinators, who are up on the screen right now, and you'll hear from these folks in a moment. And they do a lot to sort of keep engagement of the states with the cooperative alive, and we really appreciate their work on that. And then, of course, our steering committee, who helps direct our annual work plans and our strategic planning, and our many agency, university, and organizational funders, and especially the U.S. Forest Service, who all make a really incredible commitment to FEMC year after year, and without whom our work would not be possible. And then finally, I want to thank the people who are supporting today's event, including NSRC, who's a partial sponsor of this event, Alyssa Shute, our assistant director, who makes sure the conference goes off without a hitch every year, Devin Jennings, who's been helping Alyssa for the past couple of months, and then everyone else who's helping to make sure that everything runs smoothly today, including Media Factory, who's supporting the virtual experience for the plenary session, our many conference volunteers, University Event Services, and the Davis Center team. And now I'd like to introduce FEMC's new co-principal investigator, who is joining Jen Pontius, our longstanding PI. Nick brings a unique background at the intersection of forest health and technology, and we're really excited to have him on board. We've invited him to share a few words with you about his background and his vision for FEMC. Nick.
Good morning, everyone. First, I have to apologize. I don't have any slides, so you're just going to have to stare at this huge head of mine, so I hope it's not too distracting. All right, so I first want to thank Allison and Alyssa and the rest of the FDMC staff and the planning committee to put on such an event like this each year. It's always run so well and smoothly, and a lot goes into that, so you definitely don't go unnoticed, so really appreciate all the work that goes into that. So I see a lot of familiar faces out there today, but I also see some that I don't know. So for those of you that haven't met, my name is Nick Afflito. I'm an assistant professor of Forest Ecosystem Health here at the Rubenstein School at UVM. And I've been working closely with FEMC over the past year or so as I sort of assumed this role as co-PI. So when I first applied to this position at UVM, one of the things I was most excited about was the opportunity to work with FEMC. During the interview process, I quickly hit it off with Jen Pontius. I mean, who doesn't? And we quickly started sharing ideas and thinking about the future of FEMC together. And then all this happened really before I set foot on campus, so it got started really quickly. I come to this position really with what you might call a wide-ranging background. Maybe some would call meandering, but I think that's okay. Before coming to academia, I was a woodworker, among other things, and I came back to academia with just a pure love for trees and wanting to protect them. So a very simple reason. And so that led me to studying forestry at Northern Arizona University, and I quickly started working in a forest entomology lab there in my first semester. And the rest is history, really. I kind of fell in love with forest health and studied also at Northern Arizona University for my master's degree in forest health and entomology. And then I went on to the Pacific Northwest as a research coordinator for Washington State University in their forestry program. That was a really fun experience. Got to work in some new forest types. Then I moved over out to the east at that point to go to Cornell for my PhD in entomology. So that's kind of my academic background. When I finished my PhD, I started working for Google X, which is sort of a different, I guess, part of the meandering path, as a quantitative ecologist and strategist for Google. And Google works on, surprisingly, Google X, a lot of relevant questions and challenges that many of us think about in this room. And so I was really surprised to learn that. But it's kind of shaped how I view the field in different ways. So I've been working at Google X, I guess, for the past 4 years after my PhD. And we worked on things like building new geospatial models, new vegetation layers, trying to predict insect populations, all sorts of things like that. I also get to work on some new projects using geofoundation models, which some of you might be familiar with. Really cool information-dense layers that are global layers that have like really deep information embedded in them. And we can use this knowledge to predict new changes and things in forests, which is a pretty exciting, I think, emerging area to explore. So all of this experience really changed how I view environmental monitoring and forestry. And I think in this experience I learned that I don't think the real power is just in collecting data, though that's a critical component. It's in connecting the ever-growing petabytes of data that we're being inundated with on a weekly basis, basically at this point. And it's in connecting all of these new data points and sensors that are coming in to ask new questions that we hadn't been able to ask before, and to use some of these new powerful models to do that for us. So that's the perspective I'm excited to bring to FEMC for our partners, for our stakeholders. One small example of this over this past summer is a project I started working on that we are jokingly calling Chat FEMC. So it's a new framework that allows us to interact with FEMC's really rich database in a new way with natural language. And a really cool part of this project is that it's using all open source models, meaning we retain all of the privacy, we retain all the weights of the models that we train, and we keep them in-house. And another cool thing about this is that it's extremely power efficient. So to give you an example, I've been doing all the training and running on my local laptop. So it's a little bit of a different use of natural language, one that is different than we hear a lot in the media, using lots of energy and having all these other concerns. It's one that we can keep and build on our own and maintain it. And so you might ask, what can you do with Chat FEMC in the future? In this new framework? Well, you could ask simple questions like, what area had the most basal growth, very simply, without opening any data sets. Or you could say, where did tree decline happen the most in our region over the past 2 years? And can you give me a bar graph with standard error bars? And it spits it out for you, all without opening a data set, which is kind of cool. It gets a little more interesting as we start to develop this more. The hope is that we'll be able to retrieve data and synthesize across multiple data sets at once. And you could ask, more complex questions about drought in 2016 and how did that affect sugar maple growth and what did insect populations do. We've run some of these analyses where we can ask it to do like a random forest model run to see what the contributing factors to, say, tree decline was in a certain year. So there's some cool questions we can ask, all without opening a data set, and it kind of democratizes the access to this data. We don't have to be a data scientist or somebody with knowledge and all these tools to use it. I think that's pretty cool. So it's still in the early testing phases, but the hope is that we'll be able to pull from forest inventory data, climate records, insect monitoring, and then all these different data sets that live in different parts of our archive, but then also pull in publicly available data sets at the same time into a seamless analysis. So the goal, in my mind, isn't just to make this data more accessible, though that's a very important part of this, in my view. It's to move from the idea of like, here's the data, to here's what it means really quickly, and to start answering questions that we might have in a very seamless, fast way, and allowing others to access the data that might not have the tools and background to analyze that data. So it's still in development, but I think tools like this represent an emerging and exciting area to explore further. Really, along the same lines of unifying data, FEMC has built so many incredible tools over really the past 3 or 3.5 decades that the cooperative has been around. Forest Health Atlas, Indicators Dashboard, NEFENS, the long-term forest monitoring plots, and then some of the new ones like eDNA, Geospatial Database. So many really specialized tools that are incredibly valuable in their own right. However, these tools do live on separate islands at this point. So you need to use different tools to ask. Maybe if you have one broad question, you might have to move across different tools and manually piece it together. And we can't simply ask questions that are cross-tool, that require multiple tools to do that. So I think this highlights another area I'd love to put more energy towards in the coming years, is creating a more unified framework for the tools that FEMC has, and essentially turning all these amazing tools into that are standalone now, and also the data sets, into more connected layers that can talk to each other. So we can imagine a single platform where you could start exploring regeneration data, seamlessly pull in corresponding climate and soil information, cross-reference the Forest Health Atlas, and then have models help identify patterns, generate custom reports, all within the same tool. So this means just one integrated map where tools can be more toggled on and off rather than moving across tools. So we have the data, we have the expertise, we have the technology to make these connections, and I see tremendous opportunities to streamline and expand FEMC's reach in this way. So this is just a small taste of what I'm excited to work on with FEMC, along with maintaining all the amazing stuff we have going on already. I think we're at a pivotal moment where huge advances in data science, remote sensing, can help us answer some of the most pressing questions in forest health. And my hope in building some of these tools and unifying the data access, it'll make it easier than ever to explore and apply the incredible knowledge in this community. So I want to thank all of you for including me as part of this mission. I'm really grateful for the opportunity and excited to see what we can accomplish together. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Nick. We're obviously really excited to sort of see how Nick's creative vision and his really unique expertise can take FEMC in some of these really exciting directions in coming years, so thank you. So one of FEMC's greatest strengths is our collaborative network of folks working in forest health and forest management all across the Northeast. And as I mentioned earlier in one of the thank you slides, each state has a key person who coordinates between FEMC and folks working in their state, and we call these folks our state coordinators. And most of them are here today, or about half of them are here, because there's so much incredible work happening across the entire region. I've invited each of them to give a very short flash talk on a key priority topic and project that they're working in their state. And so they'll just be doing one slide, 2 to 3 minutes each. So they're just barely gonna skim the surface of these topics. And if you wanna know more, you should definitely go find them later today. So if you guys wanna come up here. We're going to go alphabetical order by state. All right, so first we have Eli Ward with Connecticut.
Thank you, Allison. Like Allison said, my name is Eli Ward. I'm a forest ecologist at the Connecticut Agricultural Experiment Station, and I'm the Connecticut State Coordinator. I've been in my position for just the past couple years, and so one thing that we've been trying to do through our program is thinking about how Connecticut's forest composition is shifting in response to different stressors. And so one project that we started to work on to think about this was thinking about how forest composition was shifting in response to overstory ash mortality from emerald ash borer. And so a couple years ago, we set up a series of plots all across Connecticut, across a gradient of time since EAB detection, a super fine scale gradient, and looked at understory plant community composition and tree regeneration. We found pretty sad results in that with increasing overstory ash mortality, we found a decline in native tree regeneration and an increase in non-native plant cover. And we found that soil nutrient availability really exacerbated these negative impacts. And so we're going to use this data now to think about how we can proactively manage these forests and try to promote native tree regeneration and understory plant communities in the aftermath of stressors like EAB.
Great, thanks, Eli. So now we have a few folks who are joining us online. So first we've got Jeff Harriman in Maine, and hopefully we can get Jeff's sound happening in the room.
Good morning, everyone. Sorry I'm not there. I'm assuming you can hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you, Jeff.
All right, well, moving forward, I'm Jeff Harriman. I'm the Resource Management Coordinator for Maine Forest Service. I'm one of the co-coordinators for the state of Maine. The other is Aaron Bergdahl, who's on today. Trying to cover everything that we would like to cover. I think we're going to start off with spruce budworm, or use that as our main focus. Excuse me. Oh, perfect. There's my slide. So our last outbreak was in the 70s and 80s with more than 7 million acres of spruce and fir that were killed, resulting in a loss of hundreds of millions of dollars. And then prior to 2023, we've been monitoring spruce budworm all across the state, or northern half of the state, I guess I should say, with various techniques, trapping and L2 sampling, and then some ground or aerial survey monitoring. It wasn't until 2024 that we recorded our first, or truly our first significant damage from the air. We actually come across about 3,400 acres. With that, we started intensifying our survey. We started looking at our counterparts in the north and the northeast on the Canadian side, and working with an early intervention strategy where we were looking at our L2 samples producing more than or between 3.5 to 7, pushing us into that early intervention strategy. Excuse me. With those increased populations at that point in time, a number of the large timber companies and land managers pulled together what we call the MVRC. It's the Maine Budworm Response Coalition. They are currently working with the Maine Forest Service, the Continuous Forest Research Unit, CFRU, at the university, and the Maine Forest Products Council. With that, their spokesperson for the MBRC advocated for emergency funding to reduce the population and protect the health of forest ecosystems and resources across the north, and preventing impacts to forest-based economy. And then going back to the early intervention strategy, EIS, this method was developed in New Brunswick. And again, that's going back and looking at our L2 branch samples that we would conduct late fall, and then they would be later tested to pick up those populations. Again, this early intervention strategy helps reduce, or looking at those areas and targeting those areas that we're looking for those populations, reducing natural enemies and other mortality factors to keep spruce budworm populations from erupting. So in 2025, we treated approximately, along with the MVRC, approximately 250,000 acres in northern Maine. We used low toxicity insecticides through an aerial application program using BT and Mimic. And then this year, we have started on a small landowner program that we are looking at potential areas of treatments to reduce spruce budworm in 2026. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Jeff. So continuing with folks who are attending virtually today, we have Eric Peterson in Massachusetts.
Hi, everybody. My name is Eric Peterson. I work for the Department of Conservation and Recreation in Massachusetts with the Forest Health Program. I've been the Massachusetts FEMC state coordinator going on about 6 years now. I wanted to touch base with y'all about southern pine beetle and its movements here into the Northeast, specifically Massachusetts. We've been trapping for southern pine beetle using plant volatiles and insect pheromone traps for a number of years now, yielding low results. We haven't seen numbers that have crossed over our action thresholds. However, in 2022, we discovered 2 infested trees in the Mashpee pitch pine barrens out on Cape Cod on the mainland. And then the following year, in 2023, we had our first outbreaks, major infestations in the pitch pines on Nantucket Island and Martha's Vineyard. Those were discovered through our trapping program and then also with the help of some of our collaborators like the Nantucket Land Trust. So we're facing increased outbreaks on not only the islands, but on the mainland in Cape Cod. We have them in Mashpee and Falmouth and surrounding areas. And the problem with southern pine beetle, although it is native to the United States, with climate change and increased temperatures and altering weather patterns, we're seeing them move rapidly into the Northeast. And one of the problems is they're gregarious, so they come in massive numbers. They cause rapid mortality and tree decline. As you can see in the photo here, they will move in a radial pattern in the way that they kill trees. So in the past, what we've done is suppression cuts where we fell those trees inward and kind of treat that whole area like a tumor, where we'll cut everything down and buck the trees up to kill what's already there. However, with these increased outbreaks, we're reimagining how to deal with this. So that's kind of my final question with what's next for southern pine beetle in Massachusetts. That's a question that we face moving forward.
Thank you so much, Eric. So our last virtual attendee, we have Larissa Robinov in New Hampshire.
Hello, everyone. Good morning. I'm Larissa Robinov, and I am a forest resources scientist for the state of New Hampshire. And today I wanted to share how we're assessing oak recovery on a site from spongy moth using drone imagery and analysis. So as with many of our neighboring states, we saw major defoliation by spongy moth in 2021 and 2022. Those years also happened to be drought condition during the growing season, so that exacerbated the spread and impact. Then in May of 2023, the already compromised oaks got hit again pretty hard by a late spring freeze as the oaks were just leafing out, and most of the newly flushed leaves got pretty heavily damaged, with many oaks never leafing out again that year or coming out and looking pretty sickly. Conway, New Hampshire was a hotspot for us, and so when a forester for the town reached out to our forest health specialist, Bill Davidson, we decided let's test the capabilities of our drone to assess this damage. So in collaboration with the Basil Lab and Ben Fraser at UNH, we flew as much of the property as we could in 2023 and then processed that data, which means we essentially classified the imagery by health class, so healthy, declining, red, dead being like red. And you can see the first year in panels A and B. Then we gave those results to the forester to assist with the salvage harvest and then to also help communicate the damage to the town. Then in 2024, we reflew a subsection of that property shown in panels C and D and classified by health again using the same 2023 methodology. Now we're at a stage where we're comparing the 2 years together to assess how the oaks might be responding. Preliminary results that compared those 2023 and 2024 health classes show more trees are declining in health than they are improving, but perhaps not as dramatically as we might have thought when we saw the conditions in 2023. More work is being done to compare these results. We're working on that this month, but I wanted to share now. Multiple year assessments like this are pretty rare, and that's because alignment and replication like this is very difficult to achieve. But we're excited to try it, and we're grateful for our collaboration with the UNH and for their determination at the Basel Lab for help making this project happen. So thanks all, and sorry I can't be there in person.
All right, thank you, Larissa. Returning to in-person folks, we have Amanda Dillon with New York.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. I want to take this opportunity to talk about a project that we have the opportunity to work on with the State University of New York College of Environmental Science and Forestry at a property they own in Warrensburg, New York. Packed Demonstration Forest is about 2,500 acres, and it has a high hemlock component. So far, hemlock woolly adelgid has not been found at the site, but we do anticipate its imminent arrival as it is at sites less than 10 miles away. So ESF is conducting some silvicultural treatments this winter to boost hemlock health and maybe make this environment a little bit more hostile to hemlock woolly adelgid by increasing sunlight in the forest. So while ESF will be monitoring the tree health, we're taking this opportunity to look at the hemlock ecosystem as a whole by monitoring the bird community, the mammal community, and the invertebrate community. So far using bird point count surveys, we've identified some hemlock obligate species like Blackburnian warbler, black-throated green warbler, hermit thrush, and blue-headed vireo. And so far these species seem to be responding more just to the presence of hemlock than the basal area of hemlock. So we're really interested to see how these communities respond to these treatments. We're also looking at the mammal community because hemlock stands they're very dense shade, very cool and moist. There's not a ton going on in the understory. So as we daylight this understory, we're really curious what's going to be coming up, and the deer population there is going to play a big role in that. So we're using camera traps to study the deer population and how they're going to move across this landscape. And this year marked our first year looking at the invertebrate population. So using pitfall traps and malaise traps, we hope to look at some of the beetles and flies and Lepidoptera and how they're going to utilize this habitat. So this is a really unique and exciting opportunity for us to look at this ecosystem as a whole and look at how these different groups of animals respond not only to these silvicultural treatments, but also to the inevitable arrival of hemlock woolly adelgid. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Dylan. And next up, we have Alana Russell with Rhode Island.
Good morning, folks. Thanks for having me. I'm the Forest Health Program Coordinator with the state of Rhode Island. I wanted to take the time to talk about our Forest Health Priority Project of revamping winter moth biocontrol in the state. For those unfamiliar, winter moth is an invasive defoliator of maples and oaks, and primarily these outbreaks have happened in coastal New England and New York. These outbreaks happened in the late 2000s and early 2010s. However, a biocontrol program using the specialist fly parasitoid Cyzinus albicans was established in the mid-2000s, and many of these outbreaks in southern New England saw declines, which was largely attributed to the establishment of Cyzinus, and that includes in Rhode Island. However, fast forward to 2022, our defoliation data started showing that we were experiencing a winter moth resurgence in Rhode Island. That started in 2022, it's still happening presently. So what we sought to do, we knew that previously winter moth Cyzinus was documented as established in the state. We sought to see what levels of parasitism were currently happening in 2024. So we did a statewide survey. We sampled 7 sites to look at parasitism. What we found was statewide, the average parasitism rate was 1%. And that is quite low, especially when you compare to another state. Maine has an ongoing and pretty strong winter moth biocontrol program, where they have some sites that have closer to like 30 to 50% parasitism. So we established that there was a need. We knew that maybe that 1% might grow a little bit, but we established a need that we would need to boost biocontrol impacts with new inoculations of Cyzinus albicans. So what happened was in 2025, the Northeastern Forest Fire Protection Compact, the Forest Health Committee, funded a mobilization. So that's like a rapid response initiative where all the participating states in this region convene to help with like a rapid response pest event. That was hosted by Maine Forest Service, and we all went to Maine to collect winter moth parasitoids to then bring back to Rhode Island. So I'm happy to report that we did this month actually conduct our first revamped biocontrol release of Cyzinus at one site in Rhode Island. And we wanted to thank Maine Forest Service for hosting us. This wouldn't have been able to be done without them. And this project really speaks to the power of having a framework established like this quick, rapid mobilization from the Forest Fire Compact, and also the strength of collaborating regionally between states. We hope to get higher levels of winter moth biocontrol reestablished in Rhode Island, so we can also then be another source of Cyzinus for those in need. All right, thank you.
Great, thanks, Alana. And then finally, we have Savannah Ferreira with Vermont.
Hi, everyone. I'm Savannah Ferreira. I'm a forest health specialist with the state of Vermont Forest Parks and Recreation, and I wanted to use this time today to highlight our black ash project. For some background, black ash is a native ash species that we have here in Vermont. It can be found in the wetlands and seepage forests of our state. Unlike other native ash species, black ash has shown no natural resistance to the invasive emerald ash borer, and therefore requires more targeted intervention from land managers. Many groups have come together to elevate the importance of black ash among our Vermont community members and really work together in the preservation of its local genetics. As a group, we have held public events where we educate the public on how to identify black ash, its ecology, and the threat that it faces from emerald ash borer, while also highlighting the cultural significance it has to Indigenous communities. We've co-hosted with basket makers 2 hands-on demonstrations that involve black ash log pounding and splint making for woven baskets. We're currently working on establishing preservation patches throughout the state. This involves finding and treating 12 to 20 high-vigor male and female black ash trees, and then treating them with a systemic insecticide. We hope to at least have 1 preservation patch per county in the coming years, and in 2025, we were able to establish 6 within 4 counties. Lastly, we are working on seed collection. 2025 was not a highly productive seed year for black ash. This typically happens every 3 to 5 years, but now our staff is trained and ready for the next bumper crop. I just want to let you know that Joanne Garton later today is going to be talking about other aspects of this project and going into a lot finer detail, so I know that my time here is short and this is a lot of information. We are still expecting to lose black ash pretty significantly across the landscape, but we remain hopeful that we can preserve its legacy in Vermont. Thank you.
All right, thank you to all of our state coordinators for sharing about all of those projects. You guys can go sit down again. All right, so we also have today a couple of special sessions throughout the day during the concurrent blocks, and a couple of the folks organizing those sessions are going to share some more background about those with you. So first we're going to have Dr. Ann Jefferson. Dr. Jefferson is a chaired professor in the Rubenstein School and the director of Lake Champlain Sea Grant, among other things, and she's also on the executive committee of NSRC, and that's the hat she's going to be wearing at this particular moment. And NSRC is a sponsor of this conference and has 2 sessions today, so she's going to share a little bit more about that.
All right. Thanks, Allison. I feel like you've done such a great job, the speakers so far, of setting the need and the challenges this region faces that we need to avail all possible resources to continue to challenge. And so I just want to give sort of a status update on the NSRC and a little bit of a teaser for the 6th grade talks we'll have later this morning and this afternoon. So as Allison said, I'm Ann Jefferson. I'm one of 5 members of the executive committee for the NSRC, which is an organization that aims to fund interdisciplinary applied forest science that's deeply collaborative and meets the needs of a wide variety of stakeholders through the Northern Forest region, which we define as stretching from Maine across New Hampshire through Vermont and into northern New York. We want our science to meet the needs of the people who live, work, play, and otherwise cherish or use products from the Northern Forest region. The NSRC is made possible through a partnership with the U.S. Forest Service. We have, between the Northern Research Station of the Forest Service and the NSRC, we have mutual interests in supporting the science and management across forest ecosystems and landscapes for this region. And not only is our work really responsive to the needs that we hear within the region, it's also aligned with the Northern Research Station's strategic framework. The NSRC really values partnerships. So our executive committee has a representative from each of our 4 states, as well as from the Hubbard Brook Research Foundation that gives us a nice NGO perspective, as well as ties to experimental forests, and then the U.S. Forest Service as well. But it's really the outer ring of that circle is who we serve, making sure that the science that we fund and the work that we do meets the needs of businesses, tribes, municipalities, states, universities, communities, and private landowners, and so on. So the NSRC has existed for more than 20 years at this point, and so we have a long history of supporting science that really meets the public-private academic partnership spectrum across the region. To tell you a little bit about the sort of science we do, we put together this word cloud pulled from some of our project titles and abstracts, and I think it does a really nice job of summing up what we do. Another way to get a sense of the sort of science that we fund is to come to our talks. And so just to sort of tie those to that word cloud, we have a talk on silviculture and degraded hardwood stands, one on forest regeneration through seedling survival and sapling recruitment. There's a talk on bioproducts and biofuels, one on sustaining Wabanaki basket making, which hits one of the themes that we're most proud of its growth over the last few years, and that's our Indigenous Forest Knowledge Fund. And then also, as you've already heard some in the last slides, the challenges that we face from insect pests and disease and from changing climates and extreme weather conditions. So the last 2 talks in our sessions today focus on those, including reconstruction of historical fire regimes in northern New Hampshire. Across the about 60 projects that we've been able to fund over the last 5 years, these are extremely productive research projects, and so just as a highlight there, 24 articles in 2024, 44 presentations at conferences like this and in other stakeholder organizations and in communities, and then 22 other communication projects. Our funding history has been a little bit tumultuous, and we had a hiatus before 2020 for a few years, but came back with federal fiscal year 2020, and were able to fund 13 projects, and then 15 the following year. Congress then actually appropriated more money for the NSRC, but it took a while to reach us, and so we got FY22 and 23 money in 23, and we're able to launch 23 projects of larger size and scope, meeting the increased need and the increased cost of doing research in the region. And then last year, we used FY24 money to launch another 14 projects. We're spending about a third of our funding at this point to support tribal partnerships and Indigenous Forest Knowledge Fund work. Congress did appropriate in FY25 for the NSRC, but that money never reached us. So at this time, we do not have a new RFP that I get to stand here and launch, and that's disappointing, but we are continuing to work with the Forest Service and with the congressional delegations in our states, and we are hopeful that maybe FY26 will turn out with a happier ending. So stay on our newsletter, join our newsletter if you're not on it, and we will keep you updated about future opportunities. One of the places that we're so grateful to have is the partnership with the FEMC, because I think our organizations really play to each other's strengths. And so we're now formally partnering with FEMC to support this conference, as well as to make sure that all NSRC-generated data is accessible, ideally through the FEMC website, and to provide some support for PIs to make that happen. And we look forward to growing that partnership in the coming years. So just to summarize, we think the NSRC is this long-standing, vital regional program that's trying to do science to answer management-relevant questions. And as the presentations that went before me and will come after me today demonstrate, there are a lot of pressures in the region and a lot of demand for research dollars. So we're optimistic that the NSRC future will be strong. However, if you would like to help me engage and try to ensure that funds reach us in the future, please find me at some point during the conference today. And once again, thanks to FEMC for having us here today.
Thank you so much, Anne. And then to share about one other special organized session that we have today, we have Dr. Beverly Wemple and then also Dr. Jamie Shanley. Dr. Wemple is a UVM professor of geography and environmental sciences and the faculty director for the Water Resources Institute, and Jamie's with the U.S. Geological Survey. And they're going to be sharing more about the session on highlights from long-term research and monitoring in Mount Mansfield watersheds.
Thanks. Great to be here. So we're going to be talking about our paired watershed study on Mount Mansfield. So we started the study because there's a lot of pressures on the mountains, and they're understudied. So there's things like ski area development, real estate development, windmills, and we just need more knowledge about them. And they're understudied because about a third of the area in New England is above 1,000 feet elevation, but only 4% of our stream gauges are. The black dots are the stream gauges in New England. You can see they're focused on the gray area, which is less than 1,000 feet. So we mobilized to study it a little more. Vermont stream gauges shown here, and the history. So where's a pointer? Well, I'm not doing, maybe the arrow? Well, anyway, we have 130 years of record of stream gauging in Vermont. Our two gauges here in the 21 to 30 year range. I wish we had time for a trivia question, but I'm just going to give you the answers. That one on the right, that's the Otter Creek at Middlebury, established in 1903. The big bar, 91 to 100, is the 1927 flood. We needed more information. And the big bar on the 31 to 40 years is the Lake Champlain Basin Program was established in the early 90s, and those are tributaries to Lake Champlain. So I love this photo. It's showing our watersheds looking from the east towards Lake Champlain. You can see in the background. So the one on the left is Ranch Brook, and it's mostly undeveloped, almost all undeveloped. The one on the right is West Branch of the Little River. It hosts the Stone Mountain ski area. Now, in a normal paired watershed study, both watersheds would look like the one on the left. They'd be completely undeveloped, but the ski area was already there. It underwent a big expansion after about 7 years of baseline monitoring. So we do have a really good before and after comparison. And just one slide to show how our gauging on Mount Mansfield does fill a critical niche. On the left, we see the elevation. See, we're near the highest elevation of all the gauges. These are all the gauges in New England. The middle shows that we are like in the small segment of all of our gauge watersheds, so we're looking at the smaller areas. And on the right, showing that we're in, mostly forested area. Most of the watersheds are mixed land use. And it really fills a niche because we get these storms in the mountains that can be really prolific, really a lot of rainfall, cause some flooding, and it's an important area to monitor. So I'm going to hand it over to Beverly now.
Okay. The reason that Jamie and I are up here is that we have just passed a really noteworthy anniversary, which I'll tell you about in just a moment, and we want to use that anniversary to host a special session today at this meeting. So the monitoring on these Mount Mansfield watersheds began on October 1st in the year 2000. Sort of quickly, we kicked in some water quality monitoring the next year. And then the groundbreaking on the Spruce Peak development began in 2003. So we had these few years of completely pre-development on the Spruce side monitoring and have continued that over time. Because of the development, we ended up having to move the West Branch gauge in 2007 so that we could incorporate water that was being rerouted for the new snowmaking pond that was constructed. What I really want to highlight with this timeline is the peak flow events that have been recorded over this period of monitoring. The highest peak discharges were recorded in each of these two watersheds on different dates, meaning they were very small-scale storms that affected only one of the two watersheds in 2010. The second highest peak discharge was in that very large snowmelt year in 2011. In 2022, we began to recognize the importance of the snow dynamics in these settings and the changing snow cover, and we received funding from the Cold Regions Research and Engineering Lab in New Hampshire to establish this project that we call the Summit to Shore Environmental Observation Network. And then in 2024, in those extreme floods that we had in the state, we recorded our third highest peak discharge. And really, the culmination of this timeline here is that just about 7 weeks ago, we passed a quarter of a century of long-term monitoring in these settings. I want to acknowledge the funding support that we've had. The Vermont Monitoring Cooperative was the original funder of these gauges in cooperation with the USGS. At a time when we really didn't know where we were going to get the money to keep this work going, the Lintelak Foundation stepped up and said they would fund it for a few years, so thank you, CRE, for being here today. The U.S. Geological Survey has, over the entire quarter century, been a supporter and a funder, co-funder of this. The Vermont Water Resources and Lake Studies Center has kicked in research funding. The Vermont Department of Environmental Conservation took over when FEMC stepped back from funding, and the state has funded the gauging. And then we've had two very sizable research project contributions from CREL and this new cooperative institute here at UVM, funded by NOAA. There are data on the FEMC monitoring site of this work and annual reports that Jamie has led over time. The streamflow data actually sit on the USGS's National Water Information System site, and so these 2 points here that I've highlighted are these stream gauges where any member of the public can download the data. Quickly, I'll just say that we have a series of publications that have appeared in peer-reviewed journal articles, student theses, undergraduate research projects, and other research outcomes that have come out of this work. And these sites have been really important educational sites for taking students out to learn about mountain streams, the relationships between forest and streams, and so on. And finally, the purpose of our being up here today is to introduce this special session that I hope you'll consider attending this afternoon. If you're one of those people who said that warming winters is important to you, you'll hear about that in this first presentation by Kate Hale, who is a postdoc here with us. If you're interested more in that snow monitoring project, Arna Bomblays from engineering will present on that as the second talk. If you're interested in the relationship between forests and snow, graduate student Jacob Ledoux has a really interesting presentation on forest structural characteristics and snowpack changes. And then we have a presentation by Megan Hickey from the state on the long-term biomonitoring program that's taken place in these streams. And finally, I just want to call your attention to, if you don't catch us in all of these sessions but want to talk, Samantha Kohler and Joshua Banish have a poster in the poster session on the Vermont Mesonet, which is kind of growing out of the Summit to Shore initiative, and you could meet around their poster later this afternoon to ask us more. So come to our session if you're interested in forests and forest ecosystems and water. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Beverly and Jamie. And now we're going to move on to our keynote speaker for today. So I'm thrilled to welcome Dr. Tony D'Amato as FEMC's keynote speaker this morning. Dr. D'Amato is a professor of silviculture and applied forest ecology and the director of the forestry program and research forest at the University of Vermont. He was a tenured faculty member for 7 years at the University of Minnesota and a Bullard Fellow at Harvard University's Harvard Forest prior to joining the University of Vermont in January 2015. His research focuses on long-term forest dynamics, disturbance effects in ecosystem structure and function, and ecological and adaptive silvicultural strategies for conferring adaptation potential within the context of global change and diverse values and objectives. His talk today, titled Forest Dynamics and Stewardship at a Crossroads, Science, Partnerships, and Adaptive Strategies for Moving Forward, looks ahead at how we can weave science, technology, and strategic partnership together to build resilience in our current ecological and sociopolitical moment. Thanks so much, Tony, and I'd like to bring you up.
Thanks, Allison. And for those that don't know, my office is about 100 feet from there, so they saved a lot of expense on the keynote this year, so expect big things out of the lunch today. In all seriousness, I come in this building every day, but it's never filled with this crowd, and so it's really awesome just to connect today and have people here in person around a shared cause, thinking about forests, thinking about where we're at in terms of the current context ecologically, socio-politically, as well as just what we're dealing with on a day-to-day basis in our day jobs. And so what I'm hoping to do today is really kind of set some framing that looks a bit backwards because we really are accumulating and bringing with us to this day what we've been experiencing over the last several decades, both ecologically and both in terms of how we think about our stewardship, and then talk a little bit towards the end as to how that kind of poises us as we move into this new future that we're dealing with. So I'm going to start by kind of looking back, and in order to do that, I have to set a benchmark for where am I going to begin with this retrospective. And so I chose the year 1990, and the reason for choosing that really is because that's the year the Vermont Monitoring Cooperative was founded, the Forest Health Monitoring Program began, and so it just gives me a nice, neat and tidy 35-year period to look at. But just to reflect on, for 35 years we've been thinking about kind of monitoring health and coming together around that issue. And so on this slide, I just put together a collection of screen grabs I could get for 1990s related things. And so in Vermont, in 1990, that Forest Health Report was talking about 60,000 acres of spongy moth defoliation. So not a new dynamic, but one that we still are dealing with. Connecticut had just put forth the first Global Warming Act in the state, and so was already thinking a bit about the impact on what was happening there. State of Maine discussing how this new Forest Practices Act that was about to be passed in that coming year would affect things. State of New York had joined with New Hampshire, Vermont, and Maine in a pact to conserve the northern forest lands on the heels of the large northern forest lands study. Rhode Island was talking about, are they going to be the first green state? I don't know. Were they or not? And then New Hampshire was celebrating awesome pulp and paper markets, which, what a thing that continued to today, right? Just joking. And then finally, those that have followed the losing ground documents from Massachusetts, this was the first year that came out. They're losing land to development, and we need to be stopping that. And ironically, that's a trend that's continued forward. And so I'm not going to belabor every detail of every year, but this is kind of where I'm going to start. And certainly we already were seeing threads that continue today as we think about what is important to us and how things are changing. The backdrop was my reality. I was in 7th grade. I wasn't reading these reports, and I wasn't thinking a lot about forests, but when I did, it was in places like this. This is the Stony Brook Nature Preserve and Audubon Sanctuary in Norfolk, Mass. And it's where I connected with the woods. And really, the more I think about what we face today, the more I reflect on those days, like what is it that I value and kind of how do I think about like what's special to me about the forest and how do I carry that forward? And it's those early periods, like when we connect with the woods, that really are influencing what we're doing today. And so it's important to acknowledge that this was my world in my forest universe at that time period. So what I'm going to go through are kind of three main themes of where our baselines have been shifting as a way to kind of bring us to the present and think a little bit about like where we're at today, where does this crossroad exist, and kind of what do we have for tools as well as frameworks and partnerships to bring us forward. And so I'm going to focus first on forest dynamics, obviously a huge theme of this meeting, a big part of the work we do, like what's changing in our forest, how's that affecting what we're seeing, the values that forests are providing us. I'm then going to get into what's changed in terms of how we approach stewardship, and it's changed a lot in 35 years, how we think about our relationship to the forest and the ways that we actually think about how to respectfully manage and adapt. And then finally, like what's happened with forest science, like where we come from and where we're going, including some of the things that Nick was talking about earlier and what that might mean for our ability to steward these ecosystems. So I'm going to start with forest dynamics, and again, in this room, all of us are aware. Things are changing, they're changing rapidly, and I'm just going to provide some general benchmarks for us to reflect on just like how much has changed over the past 35 years and what that might mean in terms of the forests that we're working with, what we can expect for outcomes, and how that might challenge just some of the values we do care from those forests going forward. And so I'll start just with a general trend in temperature. The main reason for showing this graph is for all of us to breathe a sigh of relief. Yes, this website still exists. We can get on NOAA's website and get these graphs and trends that we like to use. And what we're looking at here is essentially just average trend in temperature, kind of yearly for Vermont over the last 34 years. Obviously, this year is not complete, so I don't have 2035. And so if we want to look at this in context of where we're going and where we've come from, at the beginning of this period, Vermont's temperature was similar to Vermont's temperature 30 years prior. So our average temperature during that time period was just like it was like in 1955 through 1990. And it was also very similar to Wisconsin's. And so I'm not going to root for the Packers, but I will root for that weather, very characteristic of our north temperate ecosystems. Where we are today in terms of our average temperature in the state is actually analogous to what Massachusetts' average temperatures were prior to that period. So again, I'd love the tax base, I'd love a shorter trip to Fenway Park, but like Massachusetts and that climate and what it means in terms of our forest dynamics is very different than that Northwoods flavor. And so all of us are experiencing this, but it's very clear, just looking at the instrumental record, that we've already shifted into a new phase that's much more similar to southern New England than what we were seeing over 30 years ago in Vermont. Beverly's already showed a little bit about this, and we've talked about this as well. Just in the last several years, like we've had some pretty significant whiplash in terms of what we should expect for precipitation. And what was really interesting from a psychology standpoint is the drought this year was almost talked about as if it was an anomaly. We don't really have drought very often. Well, we actually did. We just forgot about it because we had 2 years in between that were tremendous rainfall years. And so these maps are just showing the percent of normal precipitation for our region. And so in 2022, we were in a drought, particularly southern New England. 2023, way too much rain. 2024, again, depending on where you were, way too much rain. And then in 2025, not enough. And so this whiplash back and forth, coupled with that warming, really is creating a situation that's quite challenging for us to deal with in terms of what can we actually expect and plan for in terms of future climate. The one thing we can expect, and we've known this since that 1990 report and before that, is that our region has a tremendous number of non-indigenous insects and pathogens within it. That's been accumulating for decades, if not centuries, depending on the species you're thinking about. And Purdue University's produced a really nice map, nice if you want data, not nice if you look at what it tells you, where by county we can actually look at the density of non-indigenous pests and pathogens. And so in our region, New England and New York, on average is about 22 non-indigenous pests and pathogens per county. The dark blue showing Chittenden County. It's not just the density of awesome forestry students, although we tripled that number there. It's really, you know, this county has up to 40 non-indigenous insects and pathogens in it. And so no matter where you're working, we kind of take for granted almost like the number of things in the forest that have been impacted by something that's novel, right? Dutch elm disease, oh yeah, it's out there. We just accept that elm doesn't get to be bigger than 10 inches anymore, right? There are these baselines that have already shifted in impacting what we're doing. But what we're seeing is that those impacts actually are having pretty significant outcomes as it relates to the characteristics of our forests. And I'm really lucky to get to ride the coattails of Lucas Harris. I was a postdoc here at UVM. He'll be presenting later on regeneration patterns. But Lucas has also been looking at just patterns of tree mortality across this region of the northeastern US, and that geography will make sense in a second when I talk about its comparison to other data. And so what you're looking at is just a map of tree mortality from non-human causes, so anything from insects to wind and ice and heat stress. And anything that's in red is kind of showing like an increase in kind of biomass loss to mortality, and anything outlined in bold black are actual states where there's a significant increase in mortality over this last remeasurement period of forest inventory and analysis data. So those of you that know the footprint of emerald ash borer also know or work in states where you've had spongy moth times drought or spongy moth times late season frost, know that there's been a lot of mortality happening due to those organisms over the last several years. And what's interesting is if we look at this geography historically, and the reason we chose this geography was actually to compare with a previous analysis of tree mortality in this region between 2002 and 2008. And many are, if they're not familiar with this paper or are familiar with the punchline, Charlie Canham looked at this region with others to understand, like, what is the most common reason trees die in the northeastern forest? And what they concluded is that logging is a larger cause of adult tree mortality in northeastern US forests than all other causes of mortality combined. And that's been a pretty significant point, and it's repeated over and over again, particularly as we discuss, like, should we respectfully engage with forests and stewardship or not? Some would argue, well, we're already doing it too much, that we're killing more trees than anything else. So we've looked at the most recent data, so taking 2008 to present, and what this trend is showing is just biomass loss due to harvesting across that exact same region. And what you'll notice, there's some bumps in that trend, but it's largely a flat line, not much changing. But what is mortality due to other things. And so what we found over the last recent period is that there's 39% more biomass dying due to things other than tree harvesting than forest management, with the exception of two states, Maine and Virginia. And that makes sense. Those of us know where most of our wood's coming from in that region. It's those two states. And there's 4 states, 3 of which are actually in the footprint of the FEMC, that actually insects alone have killed more trees than tree harvesting. And so when we think about how we fit into this picture and are trying to adapt, we are seeing this rapidly accelerating rate of mortality in the landscape that, at least my mindset, is triggering a need to respond, and including in light of some of the work that was just shown with invasives becoming more prevalent in areas where these trees are dying. How do we engage with this from a stewardship standpoint? So I'm going to talk about that stewardship dynamic and really go a little bit back further than 1990, because when we talk about forest conservation and what guides our ethics and guides how we go about approaching forest conservation, it's heavily influenced by some significant history. And so I'm going to go through a timeline that really begins in 1960 and talks about kind of how our motivations, our views, our approaches to stewardship really have been changing over that time period. And again, the reason I start in 1960 is that we still have some pretty strong adherence to ideas from the 1960s and that predate that are prevalent today in our discussions around how we should be engaging with forests. So if we look at the 1960s, and the periods predating that, a lot of the emphasis on conservation was we need to protect forests from people, right? We are foreign to that system, we create negative impact, and so the best course of action is let's establish wilderness, let's establish natural areas, and really try to separate the human from the forest. And as a result, we really had this bifurcation where, we had protected areas, and then we still used wood, but we just used it from places that were just producing it and creaming that landscape for forest products and not really putting a lot else into it in terms of managing for other values and goods. We recognized that that's maybe not a good deal. Biodiversity was declining. We had the Montreal process. We also had Clean Water Acts, many things coming online that really put forward that maybe we should start thinking about where we do get our wood from and doing it in ways that minimizes our impact. So best management practices, Forest Practices Acts, forest certification, ecosystem management, all these ideas started coming online and really thinking about how do we both protect areas but also where we get wood from, do it in ways that are not having major impact. This was already mentioned a bit in Allison's slides, thinking about other values that forests provide us. And so the Millennium Assessment, really thinking about ecosystem services. So maybe it's not just about wood. Now we're thinking about carbon. We're thinking about water, cultural values, aesthetic values. And now can we do these things in a respectful way that also are stewarding forests for people? And what came from that is also the recognition of cultural values, which allowed us to finally catch up after a millennia or so of ignoring it, that people are part of forests, and catching up with our indigenous partners and some of those worldviews that it's not just about us protecting forests from people, we are part of the forest, and how do we sustain forests in ways that sustain all of us, not just the ecosystem and some of those processes. And so we've kind of moved into this period of time where we're really thinking about managing for socio-ecological resilience, people and forests. We're integrating indigenous knowledge, and we're certainly trying to do it in a way that's adaptive. So I'm going to rewind to a couple of points that are just pivotal, at least in my world, and I think writ large, and how we think about baselines and the inheritance of all of these different strategies over time. So 1989, pretty key moment. It was published, you know, the idea of new forestry. Many of us are familiar with that context. And Jerry Franklin in the Pacific Northwest gets a lot of credit for popularizing what in this title was going to be a revolution in how we do things. And essentially the idea of being not just having protected areas and areas that we produce wood from, but can we have this area in between where we also still get material goods from that forest, but we're doing it in ways that is respecting the forest and doing it in a way that's reciprocal and trying to maintain a diversity of values, not just wood production. 3 years later, an even more revolutionary paper from my perspective was this Maine Agricultural Experiment Station publication that Bob Seymour and Mac Hunter put forth. They really took this new forestry idea and tried to apply it to the landscapes of Maine, a year after the Forest Practices Act was passed in Maine. And a key piece that came out of this, and ironically it's now being kind of heralded as a solution to many of our issues, was the triad approach, which ironically is just taking that protect forests from people, reduce people's impact on forests, and also kind of looking forward to the many values we're trying to sustain as a way to balance that across a landscape. Let's have reserves, let's have areas that we're doing intensive management for wood production, but let's also have this middle ground where we're trying to balance many of these goals and objectives. And I called that new forestry at the time, and it was introduced to me as the concept of new forestry when I was a student at Maine. But really what they were talking about is that this middle piece is trying to integrate an understanding of how ecosystems work and do it in ways that are not just achieving kind of economic goals, but really integrated social and ecological outcomes. This idea that we call ecological forestry today really was viewed as this is the broad umbrella for most of us to engage with the forest in. Right? We have these other endpoints, but if we're going to be doing stewardship, this should be the guide. So in terms of a shifting baseline, if we look at ecological forestry, which was new at the time, and see where we are today with that, it's pretty amazing. And so this figure on the top just shows us some books that have come out over the years on the topic over time. And then the bottom is just the number of publications over the years that we're looking at here on the topic of ecological forestry and ecological silviculture. And it's pretty clear, there were a couple of special issues in the 90s that led to like 4 papers on the topic. But basically, it went from a niche, fringe, sometimes called boutique approach to forest management to mainstream. And if you don't believe me, here's all the proof you need. Last week in the Vermont Digger, we had this article, Rob Riley, Embracing Ecological Forestry, a New Approach to Forest Management. I may take exception to this being called a new approach to forest management, but the fact that this is in the Vermont Digger, you know you've made it, or you know you might want to duck. But when we're thinking about this now, like we start with this as a baseline, right? So it's all over YouTube. Ecological forestry, it is said so much, but really there were years ago, even 15 years ago, this was still a fringe. Where now this is kind of where we're starting at, which I think is a powerful place as we move forward. The other place we're starting with now is adaptation. And it's amazing, and reflecting in your own work, just how much likely what you do or think about is adapting to some change, not just kind of understanding like how the environment's changing, but thinking about what can I do about that? And that's really become normalized, particularly through the efforts of the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science. And as we think of where we're at right now in terms of vulnerability of federal investment in different aspects of what the government does, we are so lucky that in 2009, the Climate Change Response Framework was created by the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science that's provided the playbook that so many of us use, whether you know you're using their tools or not. It is out there, and it has been so important to motivate people to think about how do I integrate adaptation into what I'm doing on the landscape. One piece of using that climate change response framework is actually establishing like demonstrations on the land of how are you integrating adaptation into your work. And so thousands of people have been trained on using the adaptation workbook, but then there are also hundreds of people that have actually gone to the level of doing a demonstration on their land base. So the climate change response framework and NIACS didn't start working in New England until 2014. And what this map depicts is just the number of demonstration areas across that landscape that's been propped up since 2014. So pretty tremendous, just the geographic spread. And the pie chart on the right is just showing how those demonstrations intersect with ownership. And so it's not just all national forests, it's not just all private landowners. They essentially are addressing the needs of a whole range of individuals, just speaking to the power of that framework for getting us to act and do things on the ground. What's also impressive looking at those demonstrations is not just the number, but like the cumulative impact. And so when we're at this crossroad today thinking about, are we going to still have funding for organizations like NIACS and the work they do, if that goes away today, which I really hope it doesn't, like 500,000 acres in our region have been managed using guidance from that group on the ground that we can document. And then again, I would argue there's probably millions more that have been influenced by the guidance that they've developed. And so we've really moved so far forward in that adaptation is normalized, and many in this room have been through this training and using it in what we do. Part of what's allowed that to be normalized is in many cases how we think about adaptation is often building on kind of old practices, and importantly, old but new practices tied to ecological silviculture. And so when I think about like how we've repackaged a lot of the thinking around adaptation, much of it is just taking what we've often been trying to think about for biodiversity conservation and other values tied to ecological silviculture. And so mixed species forests, the forest health specialists in this room have been saying that for centuries. We want mixed species stands, it's better. Well, now we're thinking about that. What does it mean in terms of a diversity of responses to climate and variability and exposure to change? Likewise, multi-age stands, giving us a range of species, a range of size classes, a range of age classes to respond to change is an important pathway for recovery. We've always thought about the trees we leave behind. Often it was more economically driven and tied to genetics. Now we're thinking about, am I leaving female ash behind? Am I leaving genetically resistant beech behind? Am I thinking about things that can actually influence that forest in the future and reduce risk? And likewise, we've been thinking about dead wood for a long time, more in the context of biodiversity, but now can that dead wood serve as a safe site? Can it serve as a thing that ameliorates extremes in that environment, as is the same for things like leaving trees behind in harvested areas? And finally, instead of thinking about managing for homogeneity, which certainly was the case when we were into the production mode, can we actually manage for spatial complexity and have that have critical feedback to what we do? So a lot of this isn't new, which has allowed us to rapidly start doing things in ways that we have at least some level of confidence in execution. But we're also changing what we do. And in particular, we're planting a lot of trees now. And if we're not planting them, we're saying we want to plant a lot of trees. And it's very much being motivated by the changes we're seeing. This figure is just building on the most recent data that's available on just the number of seedlings produced as well as the acres planted across the FEMC footprint. And so, of course, 2023 was a huge planting year, so you can see a pretty significant spike, but it's been a pretty steady increase over time. And maybe a better way to look at this is just how many people are reaching out to the New Hampshire State Nursery to order seedlings each year. And again, just using the same period, many of us are all fighting over the same red spruce every year from that site, but we're seeing a tremendous increase in the interest in planting, which really is being motivated by change. I mean, this past year alone, the number of discussions around should I be planting oak in areas that have beech because I'm worried about beech leaf disease and its impact on mass production has been pretty flooring in terms of just how many folks are being motivated by that change to do something different. What we don't have right now is the guidance and certainly the science to support this, because this is pretty new relative to when we last did this during the CCC era. What I'm going to get to now is where we do have the science and kind of where science has been shifting. And so I'm going to kind of dwell a little bit on just what we've seen in terms of the emphasis. You've heard actually threads of it in the introductory remarks as to what has been our baseline for doing science and engagement with our community. So if I start in the 1990s and think of what the main themes of science during that time period were, it was very much understanding how ecosystems work and understanding what we do to them negatively, right? And so the history of the LTR program, we both had Hubbard Brook and Harvard Forest coming online in 1988. I wasn't around applying for grants during that time period, but if you look at that time period, there was a tremendous amount of money from the National Science Foundation as well as the Department of Energy to really do good, basic, fundamental research to understand how ecosystems work. So what happens when I add more detritus or remove it, that dirt experiment at Harvard Forest, what happens when I worm the soil, what happens when I put a flux tower in a hemlock stand and then girdle the trees. What happens if I gauge a stream and see what what there is for runoff? A lot of work really diving deep into those ecosystem functions, as well as just getting a better handle on how things like acid rain and other processes affect our ecosystems. Likewise, there was some advent of better computing power, better remote sensing technology, and so people like Jen Pontius and others leveraging that technology to really monitor and see change across the landscape and what was happening out there. And so when we think about our forests today, the legacy of this really significant investment is tremendous. We have a lot of knowledge, whether it's a nitrogen cycle or how different food webs operate, from this historic investment. And again, no need to blur your eyes at this, but you can find a lot of papers out there, books, et cetera, on just like, how does this forest work, or how does the nitrogen cycle work? And really it's because we had this period of time where federal investment and priorities, to be honest, were very much on kind of basic fundamental science and understanding what those impacts are. At the same token, like the 1990s relative to today were an amazing time period to be an applied forest scientist, particularly with the federal government. There was still pretty significant research dollars going to places like Bartlett Experimental Forest, Penobscot Experimental Forest. USDA had a pretty significant amount of money going into applied work, and certainly NSRC was really critical as well for supporting the development of applied guidance for our landscape, particularly tying it both to like forest productivity goals, but also broadening it to think about wildlife goals and other values. And so our region is pretty lucky to have this traditional investment, but when I look at our experimental forests today, I think across these photos, there's one person that still actually is a Forest Service scientist. And so we've lost a lot of both that institutional investment as well as that ability to develop this site-tailored guidance that's been so critical for allowing us to evolve and adapt to changing conditions. So what's happened with science has been a pretty strong pivot towards actionable and I would say inclusive. And I included this screenshot again just from the other day from the Fish and Wildlife Service website. I kind of like it. It says responding with solutions, right? And I would argue that a huge priority within our science community, really over the last several years, you've even seen it in the language of NSRC and how that's changed in terms of the priority of their funding, is that it's awesome to know that, maybe not awesome, it's discouraging to know the impacts we're having on the world, but we want solutions to that. Like, how do we actually respond with solutions? Can you generate science for me that actually can generate something on the ground that may, either forestall that impact, minimize that impact, or at least buffer us from the changes that may or may not be desirable from that system? At the same time, getting that science just from a group of scientists sitting in an LTR coffee room is not the way to get like an inclusive perspective. We want managers, we want diverse worldviews. We want to make sure that that's at the table and really informing solutions that it can be operationalized at the end of the project. And so this idea that we're both trying to do things for impact as well as make sure that it's a broad tent of partners. So what we've done is, and I kind of say this, is moving beyond broader impact statements. And those, again, that have been in the game of applying for funding via NSF and others, there was always years ago, and it still exists, this we need to fill out that broader impact statement paragraph at the end. And so we'll present at AGU, or we'll present at Ecological Society of America meeting. Maybe I'll engage with like a local school group and share the science we've generated, and it'll have huge impact. Well, obviously, that's not really the best model for broader impact. And really what's been normalized in this pivot towards wanting solutions and wanting inclusivity is this idea of co-production, which I recognize many in the room are very, very steeped in. And the idea being that instead of me sitting in my office and coming up with a research idea and then carrying out the research for 10 years and then hoping I can shop it to someone that finds it useful, from the very beginning, including those individuals that actually have the challenge that we're trying to address in that process. And so co-production really setting that equal footing between practitioner and partner and community member and scientist, and really thinking about like, what is a solution to this challenge on the ground at this site, and how can I generate the science that then actually translates into a solution that can address both the needs, the worldviews, as well as the broad perspectives on those sites. And so this has really been the realm that we've worked in terms of the science we do. And one really nice outgrowth of doing co-produced forest science is that when you broaden that tent, which is the forest, and try to include those individuals that are concerned, that have challenges, that have goals and objectives, it by nature becomes interdisciplinary, right? All of us in this room connect to the forest in different ways. We have wildlife biologists, we have folks thinking it from a cultural perspective, we have individuals thinking about it from regeneration and productivity. And so bringing all of those challenges to bear in that co-production process means that we need to include those perspectives in the science we're doing. At the same time, and it's a little bit challenging from a funding perspective, this is place-based, and so you can't just rely on Hubbard Brook, Bartlett, Penobscot. You need to be thinking about the different places those challenges exist and bringing the science to those places. Logistically challenging, but then rewarding in terms of your generating solutions for that place and for that region. And so it allows you to basically work in those locations and understand the complexities that are tied to those sites. The final piece is that if we're honoring place-based stewardship and we're honoring the places that people are in the forest, then inherently we need to be honoring and including those voices in our discussions of what is the best strategy for these areas. And so that co-production model and that co-creation of knowledge really is critical as we think through centering that indigenous perspective in what we're doing in both our stewardship as well as in the science that we're doing, and really braiding that knowledge, as Christina Eisenberg at Oregon State would say, to really develop these opportunities for both sustaining these partnerships as well as these ecosystems into the future. And some of the work that Rachel Swanwick, working with folks at the University of Maine, looking at braiding both kind of Western perspective as well as indigenous perspectives and thinking about how we might steward lands in Maine for different threats going into the future is critical. Like how do we bring that to the forefront when we're doing our science? So if I were to say kind of where we're at today and describe all of us, so sorry I'm throwing adjectives at you, I'd say we're ecological, we're adaptive, we're collaborative, we're action-oriented, and I think we kind of have a sense of our place in the forest. But one of the key crossroads, and I think Allison's kind of diagram, the summary showing people are really worried about things, but they're not worried about cutting, is that there's kind of an in-between there where there's pretty significant debate right now when we think of like all these challenges facing our forest that like, should we actually engage and do something about it? Like, do we have a role in like managing that forest and trying to think about supporting that forest in the context of adaptation? And it's created a pretty polarized discourse, I would say, and certainly can be a challenge. And so I want to kind of dig into that a bit as we think about moving forward in ways of maybe framing this. So again, the action-oriented folks in the room, we think about climate change, adaptation. You know, we have these guides. We're going to support our forests, help them to adapt. We think about Vermont's forests. We're going to make them resilient. We have this handbook. You know, we're going to do something. We're going to engage, and it's our role to do that as stewards. But at the same time, we have pretty powerful voices also saying, no. Like, actually, like, the forest should adapt on its own. Like, you should stay out of the forest, let natural forest adaptation play out. When you engage with the forest, really it's because you need wood, and that's it. Like, you're not improving that ecosystem. Like, it's good on its own. And this is definitely something we hear frequently. Likewise, when we think about supporting species, whether, again, folks in the room think I can do forest management to make it better for breeding birds or do shrubland restoration or many other things. I can restore old growth, very action-oriented. But there are certainly, camps, again, that are questioning, like, should we, like, we don't need to do anything for wildlife. That habitat's being created on its own, or your baseline, really is including, periods of time that we were clearing, widespread areas of land base. And so again, like, you're engaging with the forest primarily to get wood, but you're not helping species. It's going to be all right on its own. And what I think gets complicated is that most of us are trained, certainly I was, and continue to try to be objective in my work, right? Let the data speak for itself, separate my emotions, separate my values from how I think about the work I do. When it fundamentally comes down to it, when we're thinking about change and the impacts of forest ecosystems, we have to center our values in that discussion. Whether I'm all about natural forest adaptation or engaging with the forest, there are reasons why I'm doing that. And so if I want that forest to become old growth again, like, I value the look and the feel and the knowledge that old growth is out there. Like, I have a vision in my mind that I have values tied to. Likewise, if I'm really into scarlet tanager, like, I value there being a certain population size out there, and I value kind of trying to support that species. And so we really need to be more upfront about the fact that we all have different visions of the future that are tied to what we value from the forest, and that we're trying to sustain those going forward. And if that deviates, then maybe it might be a reason to start thinking about adaptation. So a way to frame this is to kind of think about this just along the range of options that are proposed, and certainly the camps, if you want to call them, that often exist in our community of forest stewardship. And so I'm going to put up a diagram here that kind of has two axes. They're not perfect, but at least gives us a chance to kind of summarize a couple things. With the first really spanning the level of engagement one might think is appropriate in forest stewardship. So on one end, we have passive engagement and the other active, right? And again, those that know me, we need both, right? But some might argue one or the other. On the other end of the spectrum, we have some perspective on like what is the level of impact that global change is having on the things you view as your priorities from that forest. Like what do you value most? Old trees, wood warblers, traditional materials for my tribe. Like what is that value that's most? Ranging from, you know, I'm not worried about the impacts of global change on that, I'm just going to kind of stay the course, or you know what, I'm concerned and I might need to change action. So in these lower quadrants where, you know what, I'm not that concerned about global change impacts, I think I can kind of work with the system and assume it's going to operate as has been, I'm really in this restorative mindset. I can kind of bring it back to what it used to be, either by not doing anything or by actively doing things. And so a couple of examples might be, you know, we're going to rewild an area, we're going to protect it and allow it to naturally become the old growth it used to be, you know, hundreds of years ago. Likewise, we think it can become old growth via active stewardship. So we're going to do active management. We think it can be, you know, what those benchmarks were 100 years ago, right? Assuming that those species are still going to persist and do well. On the flip, I do think things are changing, but I'm cool with it changing on its own. So I'm not going to do anything, or I'm going to say don't do anything by protecting areas. Or, you know what, like I'm worried about it and I want to engage, you know, and I want to actually proactively do something to change that. And so we might have, you know, on this side, the natural adaptation side of things, hey, let's let ecosystems do what they do, right? They're resilient, they're going to bounce around, and I'm cool with that, and I've accepted that, or I want to engage with that system over time. So we need all of these, like quadrants, like I'm a proponent for all of them, but unfortunately, we're often getting this like one versus the other, right? We need to, you know, stay out of areas because it'll adapt on its own, or no, we need to engage with areas in the landscape because that's critical. And so what I'm going to go through is just kind of an example of how we might want to think about this going forward in terms of guiding our stewardship. So I put up just a theoretical graph here that's looking at kind of the level of priority values, and I just chose two that really aren't that talked about these days: mature forests and carbon, right, on the y-axis. And basically what we view as maybe the desired range of values, like a certain amount of old forest, a certain amount of carbon that we kind of view as a group, maybe as an organization, that we feel like, you know, this is what we want to see out there in the landscape going forward. To give it a dose of reality, there's no way that baseline is not going to shift. It's happening all the time to us, so let's just say this is our future baseline, that we want those values to kind of stay within a certain range. So we have two possible scenarios, right? I'm going to let that forest just naturally adapt and hope for the best, or I'm going to try to actively engage with that forest. And so one potential scenario with that natural adaptation pathway is that ultimately that forest is being impacted by climate change, impacted by the next insect and pathogen, and flips into some new novel alternate state, right? Your buckthorn, honeysuckle, savanna. What's important is that's an extremely resilient ecosystem, right? Ecologically, that is so resilient. So the forest is resilient. It did what it does, right? But from a value standpoint, it is not resilient, right? It is not providing the values that we, you know, kind of feel like are important for that ecosystem. And so the idea with kind of engaging in proactive adaptation is that we are trying to support those values over time and keep them within the range that we rely upon, right? And as much as it's sometimes awkward to center it on us, like we need the forest, right? And we need to support that forest in ways that are providing us some of those values back. And so it's all about kind of stewardship of the species, the functions, the processes that really are providing the values we need over time, acknowledging that we may fail, but the alternative might be a shift towards something that's harder to kind of shift back from. And to that point, I think it's valuable that if we are taking the pathway of, and again, I'm a huge proponent of it, we need to protect areas and let them be what they be, that if we really are expecting those areas to become like future like groves of old trees, and they're going a completely different direction, do we need to realistically have some benchmarks that, as we're approaching that, maybe makes sense to start pulling that buckthorn out of there because we do not want it to flip to a negative place. And so being realistic about what that future is bringing. In terms of being realistic about what the future is bringing, just a couple of brief comments. We're lucky to have experts and many talks on this, but The human side of things is getting more complicated. The technology side of things is pretty amazing, just it stands before us in terms of our opportunity to understand forests and change the way in which we are learning about them over time. And again, there's only about, I'd say, a third of the talks intersecting with these topics today. I'm not going to be a major projector, but I'd say in 5 years, I'd be surprised if there's not like 2 full sessions at least dealing with all the tools that are coming from digital forestry to influence our ability to understand forests. And so what I'm talking about, and again, many in this room are already working with this, is that we're at an amazing juncture in terms of just the emerging tools that exist in this broad umbrella that we call digital forestry. Using drones, using robots, autonomous units, allowing us to actually derive in real time things like LiDAR, canopy health assessments, acoustic monitoring, all these things that, different sensors. It's amazing, and it's only rapidly evolving. And I know in general, and I share the sentiment in a room full of folks that got into what they do to study and observe and be in the woods and that slow process of being in the forest. It's intimidating, and there's also elements of it that are, there's ethical dilemmas tied to that we need to get ourselves through. But writ large, it's here and it's going fast and in a good positive way. And so there's a real opportunity for us to start leveraging and leaning into this as we think about adapting to change. Kind of that ability to work with partners on a project and real time understand how that ecosystem's changing and then use that feedback loop to actually inform stewardship. As a simple example, there's a diagram up there just looking at whippoorwill abundance, some work that J.T. Larkin did in Pennsylvania, just using state-derived LiDAR as well as a pretty impressive network of ARUs, so audio moths recording birdsong. And from that work, pretty quickly was able to determine, like, these are the situations where whippoorwill is really happy. This is the forest structural conditions that managers should be managing for, and how do we leverage that to actually have action over larger scales that can support that species. And so that's pretty rudimentary, but the opportunity is there to really take this to a different level. And to that point, a lot of what we're thinking about is we saw it actually in some of the presentations from the forest health updates, that ability to, as much as yearly inventories are great, and I still want our students to get employed as interns measuring yearly plots, this technology is going to allow us to do like daily, if we wanted to, I guess hourly and to the second. But the ability to really monitor how that forest is changing in real time is powerful and really important as we're thinking through the ways in which we're engaging with the forest and how that forest is changing. Likewise, like I mentioned, we have the hypothesis that we can adaptively respond to things and do stewardship, but we want to be evaluating how that's turning out in the landscape. And so can we actually test, can I manage a forest to enhance snowpack? And so, as Beverly mentioned, Jake Ledoux is going to talk about his work with snowpack monitoring, and we've been doing silvicultural experiments trying to evaluate, how is canopy structure and other factors affecting snowpack depth. And so if I'm a species or a process that relies on that, being able to understand, like, what is the real-time influence and feedback between what I'm doing from a management standpoint and what's happening on the ground is critical. Nevertheless, even though these tools actually can work in the human dimension, they don't replace like the connections that we make to each other and the connections that we make to the forest. And I think, to me, that's one of the bigger fears, and that's a fear that predates these technologies. I think in many cases, how we think about the ways in which we communicate, and to be honest, like how our reward systems have kind of deviated more into like me talking to social media. I don't, but someone talking to social media, someone broadcasting themselves, saying, I did this, I did that, and having less of like the communication that's built on reciprocity, and in many cases saying yes without like what's in it for me, has been a pretty, I think, significant pivot as we've gotten more and more digital and less connected. And I think it's really critical, when we think of the juncture we're in, that, yeah, we can do some incredible space-age things with digital forestry, but we actually need to kind of recenter, like, what are our connections to one another, and how are we using that as actually a tool for going forward to sustain forests. So that'll be the last piece I talk about, and that is thinking a little bit about just resilient forest partnerships. And as Allison mentioned and others have had in threads of the conversation, the forest is changing, lots going on, it's overwhelming, and then we've had the last 10 months, right? And so we are at a pretty significant crossroad when we think of, how do we sustain work that in some cases we now have to like scrub climate out of or come up with other ways of saying what we're doing. Certainly just the level of hurt and prejudice that's coming from just scrubbing any element that's tied to diversity and thinking about being inclusive. And so how do we still do that work even though we're in a time frame where, you know, it's more challenging both from a funding as well, sometimes from an emotional standpoint. What I think is a great building block is we already have tremendous partnerships in the region that have built around common goals. I mean, Savannah's state update on what's happening in Vermont around ash, it was awesome to hear because that's happening in so many states. Like, people want to preserve ash, they want to do something about it. And so whether it's Vermont Land Trust's work here in Vermont, State of New Hampshire's work in New Hampshire, the ABCA work in Maine, the MAMA work in New York State's work, there's so much going on across our region just around that common cause. Likewise, I mentioned the climate change response framework. There's a community of practice that's pretty powerful that is just bought into that approach and is sticking with it, irrespective of whether you can say that word in a government website or not in the future. And likewise, you know, the work that was developed initially out of the wildlands and woodlands community, these regional conservation partnerships and tying together kind of large-scale collaboratives. And so the reason I'm bringing these up is that, you know, when I reflect on the last 10 months, you know, we went from a time period, literally, and actually Ann's data showed it pretty well, that there was a fire hose for a couple of years prior to 2025 of work investing in adaptation, climate change research, doing action on the ground. I mean, there was, you know, so much money flowing towards both science, towards people doing stewardship. And then all of a sudden, you know, that spigot like went off, or at least got interrupted and created a lot of challenges. But what didn't change is that there's that core fundamental set of values that our community really is committed to. I mean, there are many of us in this room, hopefully all of us, that have a pretty sound commitment to forest conservation, sound commitment to forest stewardship, and importantly, like a really strong commitment to adaptation, irrespective of funding level and irrespective of whether it's politically popular or not. And so in my own work and kind of how we think about doing things, oftentimes all of us know with resilience theory, you know, diverse species mixes are more resilient than single species mixes. And what we've been seeing, and certainly the work we do, is just having diverse partnerships has allowed us to do a lot of work still, even though some of us are suffering, we've lost funding, or we're just dealing with some of the challenges tied to that. And so what I put up here is just a constellation of some of the folks that we're really lucky to get the partnership on our different research projects and collaborations. And all of these entities connect kind of around a common goal. Irrespective of why I'm working with a given entity, like we all have this common goal. And as I mentioned, the goal is to move that ball forward. It's not about like we want individual credit for X, Y, and Z. It's like we all collectively care about this common cause. And so in 2025, you know, those that relied heavily on federal money, or at least reliable flows of federal money, were a bit diminished, right, in terms of our ability to carry work out. And for some instances, it was maybe a delay in funding, and that's you know, it's going to come eventually. But in others, it was actually like a true reduction, if not a blinking out of an organization. And I mentioned people that are on this, you're not fired. These still exist. It's just an example that federal money was diminished. And so in our work, we kind of experienced just the power of that resilient partnership and still getting stuff done on the ground. And I've shared this recently at a TNC meeting, and so, you know, call out them as an organization and really kind of leaning into to help us out in this challenging time. And so last spring, we had 44,000 seedlings that we had purchased, right? So we had the money purchased by the University of Vermont, funds that we had, and they had to go on the ground as part of pretty large-scale adaptation and restoration work where the money to pay the contract planters existed with a federal agency, and that money was from Inflation Reduction Act funds, which, as many know, is the key fund to toy with to show that you don't support climate change and other initiatives. And so the potential outcome was essentially a pile of composted seedlings in a freezer because nothing could get planted. And we're discussing this on a call with some partners about a project, and within about 8 hours, you know, it was a small amount of money came through from the Nature Conservancy. Like, I think we can get this done and help you out. They had no direct stake in this project whatsoever, other than they cared that it happened. And to me, that doesn't occur without a few things. And one is true connection. You know, where I am in my career stage, you know, I'm lucky to have had a long time to build connection. But I've also had a long time of saying yes without like what's in it for me. And I think that's really important to build like true connection with partners and really think about like how do we get through this together? Because when I'm saying yes, when there's nothing in it for me, there is a lot in it for me. I really enjoy it. And also I'm lucky to have a job where maybe after this talk I will, but I don't get fired for what I say and do. And so I can sometimes lean in more than others. The other piece is that there's a common value there. That partner really cared about that work getting done and knew that missing that one literally month of funding was going to result in there being potentially centuries worth of impact on the ground, right? And so that little bit of leaning in and helping out and trying to advance that stewardship was critical. And so I know it's embarrassing, TNC partners in the room, but it was huge for us, and I think really reflects, and I don't look at it in terms of transactionary relationships, but having those diverse partnerships when folks can lean in with time are so important when we're dealing with so much uncertainty and what's coming our way in terms of funding, as well as what might get canceled by current administrations. So the last thing I'll say in this regard is that we're all dealing with different things, and we all have different levels of capacity, but the issue's not going away, right? Our forests are changing. I just showed earlier, more trees are dying now, right, than recorded in a previous FIA cycle. We have a lot of challenges going out there. And I would say kind of three things we need to do, and one is lean in when you can, and I recognize that's not everybody, but many of us can, right? And so it's frustrating sometimes, we want to step away, or this is really, really a challenge. And I think everybody in this room, this is a biased audience, you are leaning in, you're here, you're present, you're connecting, and you're trying your best to keep that work going forward. And in particular, I think sometimes we don't recognize what we do have as unique resources to us depending on the organization we're in. And so lean in with those resources when you can, and also lean in to kind of pick up that person that can't, right? Be an ally and try to support individuals that have been impacted, as well as support those organizations that may not have an endowment or something else to kind of get them through this period. Second piece is connect, and I've been saying it over and over again, but we need real connection. Again, it's, talking to your screen, and I do it for webinars, and you yell back at it, but in terms of truly connecting, time to get out in the woods, meet with partners, give your time to others, and do it in a way that is not going to then find its way into a social media stream. Just connect to connect, and to really make an impact. Find out what's hurting people, how you can help them out, and think about that real connection. And then finally, adapt, and in particular, like I said, we need to be more upfront about what are we adapting for, and I feel like it's been a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy when we say we're going to help that forest adapt to be better. It's not about that forest being better. It's about that forest being better for all the values that we care about and value. And so we need to be better about kind of articulating that and understanding that we are part of the forest. We're trying to support and steward that forest, and there are reasons why we're doing that sometimes can fall flat when we're talking about keeping humans out and the virtues of that. So I get to stand up here, but in terms of connections, I'm really lucky to stand on the shoulders of many people, both that have inspired me with ideas as well as that I work with, and many people that get to be in the woods while I'm in the office in the summer. And so a lot of people have contributed to this work. This is definitely not a singular entity, and just want to acknowledge those individuals and certainly appreciate folks being here and present and connecting today. And happy to take any questions folks have.
I don't want to make anybody do the long walk up to the front, so I'll run this mic around to raise hands, and then folks online can't hear me because I'm not at the mic, but we will take questions from online people. Alyssa, you'll type into the chat. Okay, great. Nobody's going to moderate that. I'm just going to help.
Everybody's excited about all the refreshments you could buy, with the cheap speaker fees, so they want to get to the break.
Thank you. Can you all hear me? Yeah. Good morning, Tony. Thanks for that great talk and all of the work that you do to support forestry throughout New England. The last time that we saw each other a couple months ago down in Woodstock, we were talking a lot about deer. And I was just, I really appreciated the historical perspective that you presented this morning. Do you think that there's a shifting baseline with white-tailed deer?
Tremendously, yeah, and it's interesting. Even when I moved back here from Minnesota, of course, you work in the Lake States. I grew up here, you don't think about browse at all. Then you spend time in Wisconsin and Minnesota, and it's just in your face. I mean, such a challenge there. And so then coming back, I'm like, wait a sec, there's browse happening here, and and I think more and more that baseline, and there's been a bunch of work that's been done showing that with FIA and other indicators. I mean, we definitely are seeing higher levels of browse than historically. And then again, like I said, get to ride Lucas Harris's coattails on this. Even just the importance of snowpack and the interactions with deer browse, we're now seeing that's even more pronounced for certain species of tree not being able to regenerate as much with that, both increased browse as well as declining snowpack dynamics. So, but I think you're right. I mean, people just assume like a certain level and are beginning to, I think, adjust to that level. And as anybody sees when they put up an exclosure or have lower deer population scenarios, you're like, oh yeah, I forgot that plant used to be in this forest. And so there's often sometimes elements of it that are now missing. But yeah, it's a huge issue. And I would argue like the fact that we're talking about building walls out of slash around like big areas of forest, I mean, crazy, right? And that's just showing a pretty significant trigger of adaptation that in some places the deer browse pressure is extreme, but I think historically there was a caricature, oh, that's a Pennsylvania issue or a Wisconsin issue. And now it's like a many place issue that we're grappling with, that if we think about adapting to change and we're not getting regeneration, or in the context of the Connecticut study that was showed, we're getting invasives, that it would make sense to possibly try to do more active intervention to minimize that impact and support those values going forward.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Aaron.
All right, we have a question online, so I'm going to have Alyssa read it into the mic.
Hello. Okay, this question is from Zach Porter online. He says, Dr. D'Amato, your research has shown that 20% of New England would be put into wildlands management, and we could still meet all of our regional wood products needs. It is a plainly false argument that there are any political movements to end logging in New England. Current legislative proposals in states like Vermont and Massachusetts include increasing wildlands on private and public lands within the 10% goal of the Wildlands and Woodlands vision and the 20% figure cited in Beyond the Illusion of Preservation. Your comments today suggested that there is a significant no-logging contingent of the public, but no such constituency exists. A growing amount of the public is wondering how we are going to reach the 10% or 20% wildlands goal when we have been stuck at approximately 3 to 4% wildlands in Vermont and across New England for decades. It is misleading at best to suggest that there are people asking for no logging. Will you commit to ending the use of such false dichotomies that detract from public understanding and create barriers to policy solutions?
Was that in one chat box? Yeah, I think there's a plenty of discussion out there about no logging, and I think it's, you see it quite a bit, Zach, and I think if you want to be honest about it, it's discussed certainly in our broad community here. And I don't think I said anywhere in the presentation that there's policies to stop logging, but I agree we need more wildlands, we need more wildland protection, but I think we also need more respectful engagement with where our wood comes from. And if you look at that time period that protect forests and then produce wood, it very much emphasized the wildlands, which I think we still need to do, but really ignored like what is our impact of using wood and where are the places that wood comes from. And so if we think about levels of mortality in our region and those two states where forest harvesting is more than mortality from other causes, it's Maine and it's Virginia, which means those states are carrying the bulk of the needs of us for wood products. And the models used for that wood production is very industrial. It certainly obeys the rules, but it is treating that forest like a place to derive wood products from and not really thinking about that forest as an ecosystem. And me as someone that respects the forest and thinks about like I should be owning that impact and engaging with that impact, feel a lot better about that wood coming from many places, including public lands, where there's some pretty tremendous protections, tremendous individuals that give a lot of perspective towards that. And so when wood is cut on a national forest or state lands, it's very different than wood that's cut from Irving's land base. They're doing sustainable management, but they're growing fiber, right? And I want to make sure that we have areas where we're really balancing that full range of goods and services from the land base. And so, I could argue there is a discussion of no logging on public land. I don't think people would refute that in the region. And ironically, that is a key middle ground That new forestry, that ecological forestry, that ability to engage respectfully, when you reduce the financial pressures on the land base and allow there to be actually like thoughtful stewardship for more than just maximizing a 7% rate of return, it really opens the door to respectful engagement with where wood products come from. And I feel like in the year 2025, that should be what we want our wood to come from, not just like farmed out of landscapes where it's viewed just as a place to produce fiber. And so I think that should be the broader discussion. But we need wildlands and woodlands, and that piece of the woodlands that are stewarded really should be following those models. But yeah, it's...
Hi, thank you so much. Sorry, I'm here.
Yeah.
Early on in your presentation, you had a graph showing causes of tree mortality, and there was an increasing trend in mortality caused by pests and pathogens. And I was just curious if that was because of new pests and pathogens being introduced, proliferation of those pests and pathogens, or if it was a result of practices in forestry that was resulting in forests that were less resilient, like single species stands or plantations. Like, what's causing that upward trend?
Yeah, most of the mortality trends, and I'm sheepishly catching Lucas out of the corner of my eye. So most of the mortality trends that were going up, states like Connecticut, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, New Jersey, Indiana, Pennsylvania, and so in those landscapes, so if you think about Indiana, and Pennsylvania, emerald ash borer is really, causing a lot of mortality. Pennsylvania's had pretty significant spongy moth mortality recently. They had basically a late frost event the year after a spongy moth, so pretty amount of high mortality there. Those that work in Connecticut and Massachusetts know, again, spongy moth, drought, and then New Jersey had like a 15,000 acre wildfire several years ago. So it's occurring in forests that I would say are maybe homogenized by past land use, but it's not necessarily happening. Ironically, the place that that has the most homogenized forest due to forest management, Virginia and Maine, harvesting is causing more mortality up there. And we'll see what happens with spruce budworm in Maine. But as we all, those following that know, they're going to put a lot of effort into making sure it doesn't kill a lot of trees up there. But writ large, it's more these novel stressors intersecting with the forest. And to your question, if we had maybe more diverse conditions in those places, would the net impact be less? It's unclear. But Lucas will be, and kind of building upon that Connecticut study, kind of broadly looked at regeneration in these areas as well. And it's kind of a similar story, where we're seeing kind of natural tree mortality, less of a regeneration response, where we're seeing mortality due to management, as most folks know, a little bit more effort and thought being put into to recruitment, so there's more of a regeneration response in those places. But right now, I think the things really pushing it are the novel pests, and they're finally, I don't want to say finally, spongy moth has been here for over 160 years, but we're seeing just them behave strangely, single-year mortality events with that pest as an example.
Hi, Tony. In New York, we've definitely seen an increase, it at least feels like it, in the pro-forestation, anti-logging sentiment, and we get a lot of feedback with negative feedback for proposed management projects that we see in forest health as crucial to forest health and resiliency. So I really appreciated the XY axes you presented and a way to kind of think about that, and I think that'll be really useful going forward, like when we have the opportunity to communicate with the public on these issues. So I was just curious if you've had an opportunity to work directly with the public in the context of pro-forestation versus active management, and if you've been able to sort of present the ideas that you shared today in like a public meeting, for example, and the reaction that you may have gotten.
Yeah, I think, and again, I'm a proponent for letting places be. We need those, and we need more of them, and Liz will be talking about it in her presentation today. And so it is kind of, how do we fit in the areas where we're doing stewardship, and so yeah, we've certainly, I think we've had discussions around there's maybe 12 of us had this discussion in like a mass policy bill. Allie was on that team as well with Massachusetts with their climate forestry recommendations. Several of the scientists on that author team were like pro-forestation people. And to be honest, I'd say there was a fundamental disagreement that we kind of walked away with because they really leaned into the, forests are resilient on their own. And I think maybe because they were like such traditionally trained ecologists couldn't like put the human piece into it, that like, yeah, it's resilient, but like we're not going to be cool with like that outcome if it really is like high mortality, like what we're seeing with southern pine beetle on Long Island, right? That's just not tenable. But I think more broadly, yeah, and I think just when we think about like social ecological systems and kind of our role in the forest and the relationship with that forest and a long history of adaptation and engagement respectfully, I think that is something people can respect and understand and learn from. But my sentiment on it is that those that some people have a lot of stake in pro-forestation being right, have a lot of stake in whatever their kind of organization is advocating for. And so those individuals, no matter what you would put in front of them, are just going to kind of move the goalposts, and that's just how it is. But to me, what's important is that like the work's getting done on the ground, and that like the broader public that may not be and the kind of in those groups is like getting the message and understanding. But yeah, it's tough. And so I think the earlier comment from online, it's like it's out there, it's real, and I think the key is just to be open about why you're saying what you're saying and like what that might support into the future. But yeah, no grand revelation, Jess, in terms of like this is work, right? It's more, I think, just trying to be open and transparent about like why we're doing what we're doing and why people, and what the outcomes might be of different options, and they're all needed, but some may be great today and might not work awesome tomorrow. And again, like I'm a huge, like we have in our publication, passive or active to old growth. And more I'm like, I don't know, like it's 90-year-old forest. In 200 years, is that going to be the clock rewound? 200 years? I mean, I don't know. It is. I do know it's not, right? And so if that's how we're selling that strategy without saying, you know what, like it's not going to look like the museum. It's going to look like something a little wilder, like not in like a wild, like natural way. Like we got to be open about that because it's changing so fast.
Great, okay. I did mean to suggest that people stand up when they're asking questions. It just makes it a little easier for the virtual video experience. So if folks could do that, that would be great.
You chose me to ask. You chose me to do this. Thank you, Tony, for your interesting talk. It's a bit of a fire hose worth of information for a layperson, but I'm doing the best I can. When you talk about the pro-forestry philosophy, no logging versus the logging industry's take on things. The logging industry is good at promoting themselves by saying that they, responsible forestry improves forest health. I maintain if you had two identical plots of woodland, and in one case you send in a crew to do responsible logging, and in the other case, you send in a crew and their only goal is to improve forest health, that the latter crew would have no use for a log skidder. And I'd like you to comment on that idea.
So if I'm following it, the latter crew not taking any wood off the site. Yeah, and so I think if we could not have to take wood off the site, use something else, which I'm not a proponent for in our uses, and that I would agree, like no impact of the equipment, basically leaving the wood in the forest, kind of that reciprocity. And so to me, like the happy medium is that if we do have to go into that site, we're obviously doing it in a way that is responsibly logged, but it's also leaving something for the forest, right? And so that key tenet of ecological forestry of continuity, that it's not just about what we're taking, it's what we're giving back is part of that process, is so important. And I think what frustrates me, I guess, even in that scenario, is that like where most of our logging of wood's coming from is not in like even the responsible lane. And maybe the logging is responsible, but like the silviculture and the residual stand conditions are not. And so, really moving that needle to, I guess, like why maybe Rob Riley called it new in 2025 is that it's not happening in a lot of places where most of our wood comes from. This idea of doing ecological forestry at scales beyond, what might work for certain family forest owners, might work for certain, public entities. And so I agree that if we didn't have to take anything out of the woods and we could just do like purely active stewardship where we're like leaving dead wood, doing complexity, kind of leaving it all out there, that'd be great. But there's a huge externality to that, and that the wood's going to have to come from somewhere, and whether that's northern Maine or Virginia or Oregon or further away, like I'm not good with that at this point in terms of like our commitment to kind of owning some of what we do, and importantly, like trying to actually support some of our communities and kind of their engagement with the forest. And so yeah, from like a purely academic standpoint, yes, absolutely. From like what we exist in today with how much wood we're using and where it comes from, it'd be hard to have that be the only thing we do out there.
I am afraid we are not going to have time for all these many questions. I'm so sorry. I think we have time for this one and then maybe one more after this, Tony.
So with what we know about climate change and how it's increasing as it's going up through New England, we have species of plants and animals that are migrating, whether through anthropogenic means or naturally migrating. And each state tends to have their own definition of what an invasive species is through various criteria and their determination what plants get banned and what plants do not get banned from sale. I know in Connecticut, within the last few decades, black locust was banned from sale as an invasive species, and it kind of worries me, as these species are migrating, whether it's, we're encouraged to assist the migration and planting some species in our forests, or things just naturally popping up that, wouldn't have normally been here. Have you put much thought into how we should be making that delineation, what we should be managing out of our forests that's naturally migrating, or what we should be editing into our forests that is, thriving in the South?
Yeah, and you've kind of hit those two quadrants, like natural adaptation versus, the active adaptation. So the natural camp that says the forest, let it be on its own, like sooner or later, yeah, locust is in there, buckthorn's in there, and you kind of get that wild garden scenario where, it's totally novel, but it's still an ecosystem, and that, and again, some species might use it, et cetera. And the other end of it is, you're trying to keep maybe the invasive stuff out, and you're actually trying to facilitate maybe specific species that might serve redundancy and a value you care about. I mean, I mentioned mass production for beech today a bit, but it might be something that has, the ability for culturally derived materials that are threatened. So there's varied state level guidance. There'll be a session today for Vermont that they'll be presenting on that guidance. And so from my perspective, it does come down to two things. One is risk, like with black locust. And even we did some work in New Hampshire where someone's like, don't plant black birch, it's everywhere, it's invasive. And so people have certain perspectives on just the risk of that species becoming like an issue on the site. And there's, I think, pretty good information on traits that might contribute to that. But the other piece, and people are sick of me saying it, is what values are you trying to sustain in that area? And so if everything else is lost and black locust is the only tree that's going to get bigger than 20 inches in diameter in that forest in the future, like you might be to the point where, you know what, we're going to throw black locust at it because we just want there to be trees here. We want to ensure that they're fixing carbon, et cetera. But if it's more nuanced, or there's even just values tied to like we know it works, but I don't feel good about that species because it's invasive, then that's critical. And so we do have basically like a technical guide coming out in the next month on tree planting in the region, because it's been kind of the Wild West on how to do it and how to think it through. And part of that is evaluating risk tied to species, even like the level of movement that would be like, less risky in terms of species, et cetera. But it is an annoying, it depends type response. But I think part of it is like, how do you, like what is your core values tied to that ecosystem? What are you trying to sustain? And like, if you're okay with like a non-native species providing that structure, including some of the bird species that were on the list from the New York work with Pack Forest. Dave King did work and showed that Norway spruce supports these hemlock obligate birds. I kind of feel weird planting Norway spruce in hemlock stands, but if you're really all about those species, like you might, with hemlock woolly adelgid go there. I'm not saying to do that, but I'm just saying that'd be one extreme example.
I think we have time for one more, and I don't want to ignore the back of the room. Are there any questions from the back of the room? Because I know I've been running around up here. No? Okay. Did you?
Hi, Danielle Ozarski from Fish and Wildlife. First, I want to say I really appreciate the framework, the lean in, connect, and adapt. And I like how you put it all out there from, you know, in history and where we are at now and how that's evolved. I think that's really good. And it leads me to that, one of the graphics where you showed like sort of we do nothing with this idea of like we're just trying to pull trees out and that's all we're doing. But having a background in watershed planning, I think about the restoration work we're doing there and like we don't just leave a dam in and say it will recover. We're putting trees into rivers because if we don't, we're recognizing they're not recovering either. We're doing beaver analogs because we know if we don't do that, those things won't recover. So I look at forestry in the same way. So I would say we're not just trying to pull wood out of the forest, but we're trying to make up for our past mistakes and the legacy of impacts that we've put on the land. And then we're also dealing with all these novel stressors and things that are not native. And so we're just not starting from this, like you said, like you just let the trees grow and we'll have what we had 200 years ago. So I also believe in passive and having old forests. I think it's really important that we look at it the way that you've been presenting it. So I appreciate that. And I don't think it's ever fair to say that if we're doing ecological forestry, the goal is to just take trees out of the woods, especially when we're not making money off of it.
No, I really appreciate that, and I think those examples are an excellent kind of extension of what we've been talking about. And it's, it's been pretty striking to see the counterbalance of the discussion around this, including in wildlife conservation, that, you know, those birds will be all right. But to your point, like we've done so much to homogenize and impact, and we know ethically how to support those species. And so, at least from my perspective, if I view myself as part of the forest, then I should be doing what I can to support that process into the future, even if it does include a radical thing like cutting a tree or two to do that. So I appreciate that. All right.
Great. Thank you so much, Tony, for that really thought-provoking talk about sort of where we've been and where we're going and some of the difficult decisions that we have to make. So just a few reminders before I let people go to the coffee break. So we do have SAF and ISA credits available for folks who are looking to get those today. You can register for those at the registration desk. The SAF is a sign-up sheet. The ISA credits are a code, a QR code. So just make sure you're doing the one that you're actually looking for. We're gonna wrap up the conference this evening with a poster session, and as we have done for the past couple of years, there is an award for best poster, and we're relying on you to contribute votes for that. Voting is open until 5 p.m. and there will be QR codes around the poster session room. So please do vote. It's super simple Google form. You just pick your top 3. And then finally, we will be sending out a post-conference survey tomorrow, so keep an eye on your email for that. It really helps us make this conference better every year. And with that, please go get coffee, get some snacks, enjoy the concurrent sessions, and have a great day.